So welcome to Ballroom 2. If you look at your program, the title of this session starting right now at just a bit after 11 is A Successful Career in the Public Sector. And this is the Finance Indaba, so who else shouldn't we have to speak about the public sector than our very own Auditor-General? Please, a round of applause as we welcome Mr. Kimi Makwetu. And also I have the CFO of the Post Bank.
Post Office, sorry.
Post Office, I beg your pardon, Nichola Dewar. Okay, so I'm going to start our conversation just to say you're very brave. Two very brave individuals. We know that a career in finance is tough, but a career in finance in the public sector is even tougher. I'll start with you, Nikki. How has your journey been?
It's been a bit of a roller coaster, actually,
Really?
to be honest. When I joined the public sector from the private sector, it took me a while to get used to the way things were done. So, you know, if you want a laptop, you have to write a memo. That doesn't happen in the private sector, you know. So you have to learn the system and to be able to understand the system so that you can get things done. If you try and fight against the system, you'll get nowhere. But then once you understand the system, you can also work out how do you get things done faster and better within that system and make changes. But there's no point objecting to the system because it doesn't make sense from your formerly private sector background.
Okay. Mr. Makwetu, you didn't necessarily start your career in the public sector. Tell us about the differences and why you were bold enough to then move into the private sector, into the public sector.
Yeah, thanks very much, Didi. Maybe I could say, if you look at the public sector, it's a place where things get thrown at you, you absorb a little bit, and you throw back a few. That's just how I experienced it. I guess you wanted me to share the experience. You know, people throw things at you, you absorb some, and you throw back a couple.
Okay.
In the sense that this is an open environment, I think, because it derives its mandate from the constitution of the country.
Okay.
So that to me was an attraction because I guess I started working just before the constitutional dispensation,
All right.
1990. And so all along I've been interested in how this constitution might work,
Okay.
especially in the area where I have specific technical expertise. So in the private sector, it was a case of certain crumbs get dropped around where you are.
Okay.
You may or may not have to throw them back.
Oh.
So here in the public sector, it's a case of too many things in demand at the same time, you know? So you need to look at them and think the best way you can protect and defend the system is to throw back systems of internal control and insist on them.
Okay.
So that people who have got multiplicity of roles in handling this money understand that there's somebody watching there so that they don't take the earliest opportunity to abuse what was intended for the major beneficiaries in the country, which is the citizens. But at the same time, I think its money is also, if you think about it, in the public sector, which are aimed at creating economic assets, you know,
Right.
as well as social assets, which I think for me resonates with my vision as a person. So it was easy to migrate from that place where you must carefully watch the income statement, otherwise you are not going to get your 13th check. Rather than that which offers a long-term opportunity for other things to be possible,
Okay.
if the throwing back is responded to.
Positively. Okay. And Nikki, let's just speak about what Kimi just spoke on now, which is your social responsibility. I think one of the points in his analogy was about ethics. At the post office, how easy has it been for you to communicate perhaps your style or how you envisage the culture, but still making sure that you uphold the standard of work and you report on time?
It actually has been quite easy because we've, for the last 18 months, applied some simple rules on top of the PFMA and reporting requirements. So everything must be done at market value.
Okay.
So what is the market price? Do some research. Don't just get an intermediary for the sake of an intermediary. If you're going to have empowerment in your procurement transactions, make sure it's proper empowerment. And not window dressing, and not someone in the middle, you know. There are a couple of basic rules, one lie, goodbye, that kind of thing, that have started to change the culture. In terms of reporting, producing the monthly management accounts is fine, but getting a set of completely accurate financials done by the 31st of May is tougher. That is tougher than in the private sector, because those are the ones that the management letter is produced on. Yeah.
Makwetu, you agreeing with that? Do you find that the timelines are slightly different in the public sector than the private sector?
You see, the other reality with Nikki, she's the auditee, I'm the auditor.
So you can give an accurate account.
I have no idea if it was done deliberately to be like that. But I think Nikki is making an important point. You know, the basic discipline of producing financial information in government.
Right.
Is a much needed competence. If you think about the fact that we've got about 278 municipalities spread right across the country, who all have to respond to a particular discipline and an accounting framework, whose main purpose is not to try to be difficult, but to try to impose the best possible disciplines to promote transparency.
Right.
Because all of these monies are spent in far-flung areas, you know. So not all of us are able to supervise them every day, nor are the ministers and parliamentarians capable of doing it because of their priorities as leaders of government. And we think that if you could have those financial disciplines of people who make sure that if there's a suspense account that's growing exponentially on the debit side alone.
Yes, with no contra account.
Without anybody contraring it out from time to time when the outstanding invoice arrives and post it where it should go, either in the income statement or whatever period cost it might be. We end up having this horror story that comes at the end of the reporting season from the AG. And then you start comparing and you start seeing a growing trend of types of expenditure that are unacceptable.
Right.
Many of which people know that have resulted in other people buying cars that have got big wheels at the back. In some cases, you know. Because what stops me, if I'm intelligent enough, from going into the office at 9 in the evening, when I know that the very basics general computer controls are not in place. People normally write on a piece of paper their date of birth and put it next to the laptop. You know, because they don't want to forget. They've got too many things to remember. There's homework, there's this, there's everything.
And they can't forget their date of birth.
Exactly.
Right.
So that becomes the entry point into the application system by somebody who's clever, who's able to introduce a transaction that has got no basis and set up a payment in an environment where the controls are not in place. Pay so-and-so into this bank account. No reconciliations. Remember, that account is a suspense account. All debits go there. There's no monthly check of what is this 400,000 payment? Or somebody who looks at it and say, why is this payment exactly 1 million rand? Because we buy different things, and then you also pay 14% VAT.
Yes.
So the answer to an amount cannot end with all the zeros if there's a 14% multiplication of that amount in the first instance. And that's exactly the point. Hence the need for greater financial management skills, I think, in the public sector. Because remember, the public sector, as I said earlier on, is responsible for delivering these economic assets and these social assets, the ports, the airports, the road infrastructure, the post office services and others. That's the economic assets.
Right.
But the crashes and other things, as well as the payment of social grants, comes from the same National Revenue Fund as well. So there's got to be many of us who are looking out to make sure that those that see the potential to abuse do not succeed easily or quickly.
So, if you can explain what you've put into place in the form of substantive procedures and controls. And I think internally you need to have employees that stand up to the ethical standards, but also to say the controls are in place for us to make sure that the work goes well. Do you have a horror story or maybe a success story as to putting controls in place and having them work for us?
I think I have more of a journey to talk about than a success at this stage, because you can always improve your status of controls. We're still being audited on a substantive approach because there are some issues with some of our security around systems, the internal ones, not external. We've got decent firewalls and stuff. So we are filling the IT general computer control gaps at the moment in the post office. The bank is something completely different. They are on their own systems. It meets the banking industry standards, but the rest of the post office, in their history, do you really need robust IT systems to move a piece of paper around the country? Not really, in terms of the old thinking and the planning. But now, with the digital economy coming on board and with electronic products disintermediating the physical paper, you actually do need those systems. So we're working on plugging those gaps. We do have compensating controls with reconciliations, looking at suspense accounts, looking at round numbers. I mean, some people have tried to kind of put 32 billion rand transactions through Postbank, and they end up in jail. Because clearly, that's just a ridiculous number, a round number as well, So there have been a number of cases where people are paying the price for attempting things that they shouldn't have. But our systems of control are actually improving. We're getting into a better state of doing the monthly things the way they should be done. Your normal, if you treat each month end like a year end, then year end is not an issue. And that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. So it's a journey at this stage, yeah.
So internally, do you have your own internal audit procedures? And by the time your auditor then arrives, is everything up to standard? Or do you rely on the controls that you've just spoken about to do the work?
It's a combination. So we do have internal audit.
Okay.
They have appointed a couple of new CAs to challenge me and my team, which is good. So I'm anticipating the next audit will be much better from the AG's perspective. In terms of our routine stuff will have been tested a few times before it gets to them for audit. But again, it's part of a journey. I mean, last year, not this last year, the year before, we had 10 qualifications, and some of them were disclaimers on specific items. So understand, that's the journey we're coming through. We reduced that to 3 repeat items this last year in 2017. Next year, I want none. That's the game. That's the goal.
But that's a good goal to have. And you just spoke about 2 or 3 new CAs that you've got on board. We have a lot of people in the professional sector right now that are as patriotic as you and I, but are somewhat demystified about going into public practice. Mr. Makwetu, let's speak a bit about the journey and the career opportunities that are open to the ethical professionals that are looking to work, for instance, for an institution like the Auditor-General.
Didi, there's no doubt that a lot of people, as you're asking this question, are asking themselves about, is this the right place to work in, the public sector space generally? You remember when I said things get thrown at you and you absorb some?
Yes.
So it is the interrogation of that which is being absorbed.
Okay.
What is this that's being absorbed? Because remember, you are dealing with people generally, whether you are looking at it from the AG side or whether you are looking at it from a financial management role side in the public sector. You are dealing with people who generally have set up what it is that needs to be done. Okay? And some of these disciplines and procedures can come across to them as nuisance. That's the stuff that you need to absorb a bit. Try and analyze what do they mean this is a nuisance. Because it could be between, I really do not understand it, on the one extreme, to the other extreme, I'll just play as if I don't understand it so that I can get my way. So it's the capacity to feel it as well. I don't know how you grow the capacity to feel something, but there's got to be that level of capacity to understand as well what journey are these people on, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who go to Parliament and decide that they are going to collect 1.4 trillion of tax with a view to do something about it.
Right.
And you don't fault that something that they want to do, because it's most of the stuff that's in the Constitution and in the laws. But there always is a chance to try and find the quickest route to get there. Hence the issues of deviation from supply chain that gives rise to irregular expenditure. Hence the occurrences of payments being made in advance of services being delivered, with a promise to get these services delivered after 6 months, but when you come in month number 7, only a trickle arrived. But remember, the money left the bank long ago. It's sitting in somebody else's bank account in the meantime, you know? Then, because you know in the public sector, people change. Somebody decides, okay, the people that are here now are going to be different for whatever reason. Then the line of command and the ability to follow through on commitments and decisions made is also cut somewhat. Because the other person that comes now is going to be preoccupied with other instructions that they got when they occupied that particular role, let alone when 1 or 2 of them are also suspended for a long period of time. Have you read about recently some who are on suspension for more than 2-3 years? They were not sitting idle at the time that before they were suspended, remember? They were busy with something that was not complete. But as soon as that umbilical cord was cut, the other guy that came to replace this one who's suspended is not going to pursue the things that that person was doing which may have been the reason why that person has been tossed anyway.
Right.
They're going to start focusing their efforts on this other instruction that they are given. So it becomes hectic to operate in a busy environment like that. And that's why I'm saying things get thrown at you. You must have the ability to absorb some and throw back others, you know, because that's the way to deal with this thing. You're not compromising your values and your ethics in that process, but you are trying to deal with what you have. Unlike everything is clear-cut, the truck leaves, you must raise a delivery note, and the delivery note must match the invoice, and the guys in the factory who raise the data must make sure there's a matching of those documents that deliver the stuff to the amount that's raised in the invoice, unless the truck is hijacked on the way. Otherwise, the transaction will arrive, or rather the goods will arrive the other side. And therefore, whatever we have in debtors, we know it's in respect of the truck that was delivered on Tuesday. You can explain that when someone has been given billions of rand to build 78 units of houses.
Right.
And then you go to the physical place, you only found 28.
And that's difficult to
Then it's
justify.
difficult to find out what happened to the other 50, because really the very basic concrete was never laid here as a starting point, you know? The very basic concrete that you see in the other 24 was never laid in this site. There was never any concrete. But the other reality is that the money is also not in the bank.
So as the Auditor-General, I think your responsibility in auditing and doing physical observations is greater than it is also on the monetary aspect, because you see the transactions going through, and it's also about services rendered a lot more, and the services that aren't being rendered. But a point that you're making is that it's quite a volatile environment in that the work account and the people assigned to do certain duties tend to change often. Is there not a control that the Auditor-General can put in place to have for each project those assigned to the projects to stay for the prescribed period? Or perhaps if a project should take something as long as 24 months, to be broken down into lots of 6 months, in that the audit and the flow of funds will be capped so that there's less corruption or less outflow of funds and no services rendered.
You know, when you arrive in Kimberley, and then you get out of the airport, there's a big public facility that's being built there. It's the Northern Cape Mental Facility. It was designed and agreed some time in the early 2000s. So it started, and then they did the first phase. And then all of a sudden, there was a disruption, in respect of supply chain related issues. And then the guys left site. They were not there. The thing was just lying around on its own.
So there's no construction happening
No.
for a while.
And then they came back, a different group of suppliers or contractors, to come and take off from where the others left off. In the meantime, some of the materials that were bought in order to install whatever was needing to be installed, whether it was electrical or whatever, was exposed to the wind, the rain, the sun, and all those little things over a period of time. And then when you come back to site, you must first take those things that you bought and check if they are still in usable condition, and then possibly go spend some money again to go and get the same things that you bought initially to replace the ones that got through the elements. That's the kind of stuff that you find in some of these. And I don't know that, as we speak now, the first patient has already been admitted there. As we speak now, I'm talking about a project that has come a long way. I'm sure many of us have seen on TV different visits of SCOPA, different visits of Portfolio Committee for Health in the National Assembly and everywhere else. All of those going there to say the same thing, but nothing happens. So that's the reality. So you can't give a task like that to an audit office, because if you look at the hierarchy of power, the audit office is not more powerful than the people that are elected.
Okay.
Because it is brought about by them. So you can't give that office the power that is going to be ahead of those that are elected. Because the first question they're going to ask is, who elected you? For you to come and insist to me that I shall. Who elected you? That's where the breakdown would come from, even if you tried harder. I think the instrument that was designed in the Constitution is such that those that are elected are the ones who are supposed to do all of these things. They are supposed, they are the ones who say, this hospital shall be complete by such and such a date.
Right.
And if it's not, there shall be whatever else needs to happen to whoever is involved in that decision making. It can't be the audit office, because ours is normally to come and check whether there is sufficient superintendence and administration over the affairs of the entity and report accordingly.
Right.
That's where we stop.
Nikki, have you ever experienced a time where you've either had to cut a project or suspend a project for a time being because there were irregularities?
Yes, and there have been times where I've had to suspend people for supply chain irregularities and get them through a disciplinary process. So it's very important that you do what is right, not just for your company, and the entity or the organization you're working for, but also because you're not working with your own money or your company's own money.
Okay.
You're working with
State
the government's money, and it doesn't belong to us. So we are custodians of that. And so you have to make sure that it's applied in the right way for the right reasons. In the post office, we've got a dual mandate. We've got a commercial mandate. We expect it to be sustainable.
Okay.
But we also have a social mandate to deliver services. And there's tension between the two. And you have to learn how to balance that tension. It's not always that easy.
And how do you then deal with the stakeholders, your counterparts, who are expecting X of you, but realistically it's not possible? For instance, ICASA will give you a limit to say, well, your stamps can't cost more than X, but your costs to get a letter from Paternoster all the way to Johannesburg will cost more than that. As the CFO, you see the financial loss or the financial, I don't want to say loss or deficit, but struggle to keep the unit afloat. How do you then advocate for the costs that you want to have implemented and keep the business going?
I think in our case, there's a bit of a misconception because the Postal Services Act says, the post office has a reserved area, so anything under a kilogram has to go through the post office. Things have changed.
As a service provider.
And that regulated area is internationally very difficult to regulate anymore. So we no longer really have a monopoly on the movement of things. Now, if you have a monopoly, the revenue you generate from your standard letter should fund the costs of the social obligation.
Okay.
but it hasn't done so for many years.
Is that because you don't have the volumes now?
No, it's just a factor of economics. The regulated price is too low.
Okay.
And also, we are required to have branches in unprofitable areas, in the rural areas. But it's important because it's a government infrastructure. So we've motivated to Treasury for a subsidy, given that there is actually, in effect, no reserved area, and ICASA can't regulate it anyway.
Okay.
And it's an international trend.
Okay.
But in that motivation, we're actually saying, let us ring-fence the social mandate portion of our business in a separate company, and then there's no cross-contamination. So then if there is an amount to be paid to support that service, then you know that we're not dipping into that for other purposes.
And how has technology changed the way you work, or your productivity levels and the money that you need to make? Because if 10 of us were formerly sending love letters to each other, and now we send them in the form of email. How have you been able to counter that?
Look, the revenue that we get is largely from large corporates, because they actually find that physical pieces of paper are paid more. People pay more attention to that than to an SMS or an email, because you get bombarded with all of this electronic stuff, so people switch off. So there's still value in moving paper. Most of our revenue comes from corporates, very little from individuals, because you're right, they've found alternative ways, WhatsApp, texts, yeah. But our challenge is not how do we keep the old letter afloat, it's what do we do differently so that we become more relevant. So we need to look at how do we position ourselves with e-registered mail, because we've launched that. So you don't need the physical registered mail, you can get an electronic delivery through our trust center.
Okay.
So we've got a very high-powered data center which issues Class 4 digital certificates. And that it's embedded on that. How do we then foster e-commerce? So how do we stimulate economic activity in the rural areas? And bring them into the banking sector, so Postbank fulfills its mandate.
Right.
And we move their stuff, and we give them access to tools and connect them with, say, the IDC for funding, etc. So that's the role that the post office will play later,
Okay.
not the movement of physical bits, because we're not actually a post office. We're actually a government infrastructure that is not being properly used, in our view. The more government pushes through that infrastructure, the better, because it's fully paid for by government.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've spoken about all of the painful things and the things that haven't worked well. I think let's talk about what are the good things. What do we look forward to? I'll go back to Mr. Makwetu and say, what changes is the Auditor-General putting in place to make transacting or tax money used better?
You know, when we released our 2016 audit report in the public domain, I think it was somewhere around November of last year, our chair of the standing committee on the Auditor-General, the same person that chaired the SABC inquiry, pronounced on what the way forward must be for the audit office at the time. And his view was that there will be a need to look at whether the Audit Act that governs our activities could possibly be looked at. So that's what we had submitted earlier this year to Parliament, a submission that proposes to allow us the authority when we identify certain things. You know, when you look through the cupboards in an audit, sometimes you open deeper in the cupboards and you still realize that there are some remaining cockroaches that you need to make sure they are dealt with, all right? Most of these come in the form of this growing level of irregular expenditure, which means that there's a potential risk that inherent elements of abuse in the system could now have become the new standard. Why? Because in the absence of consequences in an environment like that, the gratifying effect for someone who presides over that is the fact that I can continue to deviate from the supply chain management disciplines and channel all the work that I am responsible for awarding without following due processes to an entity that I may have an indirect interest in. Meaning that you're going to now get settled over time with higher than usual prices because there's no real oversight in the mechanism to follow up on why there are instances of the likes of irregular expenditure.
Right.
Why wasteful and fruitless expenditure growing? Why is the accounting system not reliable, always subjected to multiple volumes of journal entries that are processed in the books only at the time the audit is being done? Which means that for the greater part of the 12 months of the year, the due processes and disciplines that protect the finances were not in place.
Followed.
So the power that we seek to get, therefore, is to say, after we have signed off on the audit, and we have concluded that an audit, as an example, was disclaimed, meaning that the auditors were not satisfied with the evidence that was provided to them in some instances. Either a contract is no longer known where it was filed, just because it might contain detail that will be incriminating to whoever. So if you end up with a disclaimer and nobody's going to do anything to you after you've got that report, you might as well carry on doing what you do.
Over and over.
So what we are proposing, therefore, is to give us the power to take those matters, because we would have gone and grab in the cupboards while we are auditing,
Yes.
and find instances where this looks a little bit suspicious. When you look at the list of entities that were used for a particular service over the last 12 months, we are now using electronic data tools to interrogate the system rather than asking for an
physical
isolated
document.
invoice that may not give you what you're looking for.
Right.
So there are certain trends that you can pick up in data when you look at it with a forensic approach.
Yes.
When you audit. And so you can mine in that and find out that, okay, ABCPDY, whenever there is a mechanical fault with the fleet of vehicles in this particular municipality, is always the guy that does this thing, including panel beating.
Okay.
And if you take the history of all these transactions over a 12-month period, you realize that, geez, it's almost like 3 million rands worth of services. And then if you dig deeper, and you see that there's a significant deviation of supply chain, because if there's a need to extend that original contract, it just gets signed off without any due process followed. It's instances like those that we are looking for this power to be able to say, take these matters and hand them over to an investigative agency that will get to the bottom of these issues. Because an audit, remember, is a 2-month process. We get the financial statements at the end of May. By July, we must sign off. So we kind of see certain things, but we know that there's no power to give us the next stage to hand it over for final investigation. And that's the kind of review that is being done on our audit work. But we want to extend it also to have a very biting consequence if something is found out of that investigation to have been perpetuated in order to satisfy a self-interest or to rob the system of the monies that have been allocated for services and other things. Then we can always say that this kind of expenditure, after we've seen this report, looks like the type of expenditure that we must disallow.
Right.
Now, when you disallow expenditure that's already incurred, you remember it's a credit to the income statement, and then you must debit another account.
Correct.
Debtors.
The debtor now, right? And then the power to then, within the instrument of the legal system, to give the Auditor-General to write a little note, like the letter you were talking about.
Yes.
A little note which indicates to so-and-so that as a result of the outcome of this investigation pursuant to so-and-so audit, there is an amount that will be surcharged which has already been credited in the income statement and raised in a surcharge account owing by you, Miss or Mr. So-and-so. You have X number of days within which to settle this, otherwise you also have a right to appeal. That's what we are looking to get, so that these things do not go and grow into the next generation. Because remember, the other part of these public funds are also not about us only. They are also about the creation of those assets that will be used by
The future
the next
generation.
generation to generate economic activity for themselves, so that they don't start building water treatment plants every time, you know?
Yeah.
Those things are needed forever and a day.
Yes.
Why must we allow a situation where someone pays 3 times what it costs
To do it once.
to build a water treatment plant and not do it well, and then it doesn't get maintained, and then the lack of maintenance results in additional money being, say, budgeted to fix this thing when it breaks? That's, I think, the kind of disciplines that all of us need to make sure we look after, because the taxes come from us,
Right.
all, but we also have a vested interest, even if we are in private sector businesses, because when the potholes grow into big stuff, It affects our tires and our businesses, isn't it? And then before you know it, you are replacing things every now and again because the public infrastructure is allowed to deteriorate. I think that's the crux of it. I mean, if you look at it in terms of what is the difference between the public and the private sector, I don't think there is. There is an interdependency between the two, because the one creates assets that are used by all of us, whether we are in the public or the private sector. But we should be interested in the instruments that protect these resources, as well as make sure that the people who are elected to do so do it even better.
Yes. And Nikki, going forward, what good things can we expect from your end? Any plans in process that you can speak about?
There are plans in process,
Okay.
especially in the e-commerce space. But
Yeah.
I think moving back to the financial disciplines, I mean, just planning better would get rid of a lot of the frustrations and the applications for extending a contract, etc. I mean, you have to uphold the Constitution. So you have to rotate your suppliers or go through fair processes regularly so that you're not stuck with the same supplier for 20 odd years. Because that's unfair. The other thing is, how do you actually work together with organizations so that you actually create need as opposed to dependency?
Okay.
So how do you work in an ecosystem where everyone can contribute? So instead of, say, the post office deciding to invest in a system and spend lots of money and do it badly, how do you partner with people that already have systems? Because the pace of change is big. So how do you go through a proper procurement process to get those systems on board so your speed to market is faster and our cost to the government is lower as well, but without throwing unnecessary money away? So you have to watch the economics very carefully. In fact, more carefully than if you're in the private sector where you've got a profit objective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for answering that, Nikki. I'm going to open up to my audience in the interest of time. I'm going to take exactly 2 questions. When I do take your question, I'd like you to please give me your name, which institution you're from, and then shoot straight into your question. I've got one here and one there, and that's it. Thank you. Please stand.
Is it good morning still?
Yes.
My name is Zimbili Manglana. I'm actually from the Office of the Auditor-General. What I wanted to... Hi, AG. With what you were saying now with the amendment of the APA, will it currently, at the Office of the Auditor-General, we don't actually comply with the APA. I want to take this to Section 45, where auditors would generally have the obligation to report reportable irregularities. Since we don't have that duty, is this then now similar to that? Because then if you can, at the onset, immediately report something, because sometimes I feel we do come across such irregularities, but since we don't have the onus to sort of report them to an independent body, is this sort of then whom then they can investigate that matter further? Is this then amendment of what's our act? The Public Audit Act, PA, I'm going to get fired. Is this then sort of, in essence, covering us in a way that we also have some sort of control to ensure that these don't just only end up on the management report and the audit report and then no one does anything about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for that question. You've hit the nail on the head. Because shining the light into these areas is about giving substance to Section 45 of the Audit Professions Act. What used to be Section 25 in the previous Public Audit PAAB Act. So that's what we are trying to do. But at the same time, I think it's important to bring along that journey the people who are supposed to do something about that as well, because there's no use reporting every year instances of reportable irregularities and no one does anything about it. So the ability to tighten that in legislation, at least within the framework of the audit institution, will provide sufficient light into those dark corners. Like the whole issue, I mean, remember when there was a time when the TV station used to switch off at some time, I think some many years or so ago, and then the TV goes off. It had a big logo that had a watch and all that stuff in there, you know. And then when that thing is gone, there was never things like irregular expenditure on TV during that time. You remember? Even later on, I mean, issues like, I mean, we would talk about everything except for fruitless and wasteful expenditure and irregular expenditure and clean audits and disclaimers and that type of stuff. It's the language that has come through after the audit officer was able to elevate these issues into the public space. So I think even with issues of that nature, you don't want them to grow over time, because when you read about certain injections that are made to state-owned entities, it's purely because some of those things were starting to take shape over a number of years before, and there was no action that was taken to deal with them. So it's almost like your credit card, you know, every time you have a credit is when you've paid and then you have a little bit of allowance to spend another 20 rand and so on. You get to a point where that 20 rand is no longer available as well. And I think that's the cumulative effect of not having done that kind of exercise. And that's exactly the reason we think that let these things not be the conversation of the day. Ooh, regular expenditure has moved from 31.4 billion in 2014-15 to 46.6. And then when you compare that, the only reality for you is to lament the fact that, hey, we are being taken for a ride kind of stuff, and it ends there, you know? So I think this is an effort to try and get people to do something about it. Because that's money in physical terms. And if you can think about it, a lot of it has normally got about 9 zeros before the comma.
Thank you very much, AG. There's a question over here. Just remember to say your name and where you're from. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Thavisa Mokoni. I'm from Vodacom. I found it very interesting that she corrected that she wasn't from Post Bank, but from Post Office. The question I wanted to ask is also linked to what she also alluded to, and you had already, I think, started answering it with a new act that's coming about, because I wanted to ask just how much power does the AG actually have over the government and all the things that you audit, you know, and also just to find out all the things that we're always hearing about corruption and everything on TV and on media. Has it been things that you have already reported on, and what actions were actually taken? Have people been jailed over some of these things?
Who'd like to answer that question?
Yeah, I think if you look at the power, what power the AG has, the AG has got the power to tell things that other people do not normally tell. That's the one. So secondly, let me give an example with PRASA. If you go look at the audit report and the management report for 2014, the matters that were expanded on in the investigation that subsequently took place through the public protector were already reported in the management letter. I can draw attention to, for example, the Swifambo matter. At the time the procurement was happening, there were certain difficulties that were encountered during the course of that audit, which we shone light onto. But as we have always said every year, if you don't act on these matters, they become the inherent feature of your environment. Now, as I said earlier on, an audit can only really master the art of getting to the bottom of these issues only within 2 months. From the 30th of May, when they receive financial statements, to the end of July, when they have to report. Now, the management letter is almost not as comprehensive as a 3-year-long investigation would be able to uncover. If you remember, again, from that report of the public protector, there was certain reference to the fact that even after the 3-year effort, we still were not able to get to all the documentation that we needed in order to conclude on different matters of the investigation. So if you weigh the two, you can see that in an environment where there is no response to issues that are raised even through a statutory audit, the chances are that that culture will perpetuate itself into the future until somebody is given 3 years to go back to all of those years where these matters were highlighted. And I think that's where the reality is. And I think when you focus on, well, these things were happening, at the moment when we were signing off on the audit reports, we could not conclusively say these are corruption matters, but we could say that the extent of the deviation from the systems of internal control create an opportunity for people who want to divert resources out of the system to succeed. And that is the purpose of raising a management letter. The only problem is if you don't get a response from the people who are running the institution, you've got no leg to stand on as an auditor. Hence, we are thinking that in introducing this power, it will be in our control to say we have examined the financial statements, we've come to this conclusion. However, here's a tag-along of issues that we believe need to be given specific attention and investigated so that a decision can be taken in respect of correcting that weakness in the system, but dealing with the people who are also charged with the oversight responsibility if they don't do it. Because it might well be that you look away because there's an opportunity that translates into a benefit either directly or indirectly. So there's no looking away because you're getting paid for in that role to supervise the administration of the environment and to play a role of a superintendent. A superintendent is not the person who prepares the work paper, but is the person who makes sure that the work paper contains all the elements required to reach a conclusion, even if it's an auditor.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Thank you for joining us in Ballroom 2. If you can give me, my panelists a big round of applause, the Auditor-General and the CFO of the South African Post Bank. And thank you for joining us.